There are moments when heaven moves, and there are moments when darkness panics. What if I told you your worship can trigger emergency alarms in the kingdom of darkness? An ex-satanic agent has spoken, and what was revealed is not normal. It is dangerous. It is hidden. It is real. Because when you worship like this, they don't ignore you, they mobilize against you. There is a kind of worship that heaven recognizes instantly, and there is a kind of worship that makes darkness tremble without warning. The ex-satanic agent revealed something chilling. Not all worship is equal in the spiritual realm. Some worship is routine. Some worship is powerless. But there is a dimension of worship that forces an immediate response from the kingdom of darkness. He said when believers enter this level, emergency rituals are activated, not later, not eventually, immediately. Because at that moment, you become a threat. You see, many people think worship is just singing songs. They think it is just music, melody, and emotion. But in the unseen realm, worship is a weapon, and when used correctly, it pierces dimensions. The agent described the moment he witnessed during his time in darkness. A gathering was taking place, rituals were ongoing, assignments were being distributed. Everything was calm, everything was controlled, until suddenly something shifted, not in the room, but in the spirit. Alarms began to rise. Urgency filled the atmosphere. Why? Because somewhere a believer began to worship in spirit and in truth, not casually, not distracted, but fully surrendered. That kind of worship releases light, and darkness cannot tolerate light. So what do? They respond. The agent said this clearly. When Christians worship like that, we don't ignore them, we gather. You need to understand what that means. It means your worship has impact. It means your voice carries authority. It means your devotion is not invisible. But here is where it becomes dangerous, because the same worship that attracts heaven also provokes hell. When you worship with distraction, nothing moves. When you worship out of routine, nothing shifts. But when you worship with fire, with focus, with full surrender, you step into a battlefield. The agent described how emergency rituals were called to counter such believers. Assignments were changed, spirits were redirected, because the worshipper had become a threat. And most believers don't even realize this. They underestimate their own spiritual authority. They treat worship as an activity, not a weapon. But listen carefully. The moment your worship becomes genuine, the moment your heart aligns with heaven, the moment you forget about everything else and focus completely on God, something breaks in the spirit. Chains begin to loosen. Strongholds begin to weaken. Dark systems begin to shake. That is why the enemy cannot stay silent, because true worship disrupts his operations. The agent explained that in those moments, their goal is to interrupt, to distract you, to make you tired, to fill your mind with thoughts, to make you stop. Because they know if you continue, you will break something they cannot repair. Have you ever noticed that when you decide to worship deeply, suddenly distractions increase? Your phone rings, your mind wanders, you feel sleepy. That is not random, that is resistance. Because your worship is approaching a dangerous level, and they cannot allow it to continue freely. But here is the truth they don't want you to know. If you push past the distraction, if you remain focused, if you continue despite the resistance, you're crossing to a realm where their influence begins to collapse. The agents said they were believers they feared, not because of their titles, not because of their position, but because of their worship. These were people who didn't just sing. They engaged, they pressed in, they surrendered completely. And when they did, darkness had no choice but to respond. Emergency. Rituals were not called for weak believers. They were called for dangerous ones. And dangerous believers are worshippers who understand their authority. You need to hear this clearly. Your worship is not small. Your worship is not ignored. Your worship is not powerless. It is being monitored. And when it reaches a certain intensity, it becomes a weapon that cannot be contained. So the question is not whether you worship. The real question is, how do you worship? Because there is a level where heaven responds, and there is a level where hell reacts. And once you enter that level, nothing remains the same. There is a dangerous pattern that the kingdom of darkness studies closely. The ex-satanic agent revealed this with precision. They do not fear noise. They do not fear routine gatherings. They fear consistency in true worship, because consistency creates momentum, and momentum creates spiritual authority. He said something that should shake you deeply. One moment of powerful worship is dangerous, but a lifestyle of it is unstoppable. Do you understand what that means? It means the enemy is not only watching how you worship, he is watching how often you sustain it. Because one encounter can shake darkness, but a lifestyle can destroy systems. That is when emergency rituals are not just activated, they are intensified. The agent described believers who became targets over time, not overnight, not suddenly at all, but gradually because they refused to stop. They worshipped in the morning, they worshipped in private, they worshipped when no one was watching, not for show, not for recognition, but from a place of deep connection. And that consistency built something in the spirit. It created a fire that could not be easily extinguished. You see, many people have moments of passion. They worship strongly once in a while. They pray deeply occasionally, but then they return to distraction. They return to routine. They return to spiritual inconsistency. And when that happens, the pressure on darkness reduces. But when you become consistent, you become a problem. The agent explained that consistency forces darkness to track you, to study you, to assign watchers, because your spiritual growth is no longer random. It becomes intentional, and intentional believers are dangerous. He described how in their system names were recorded, not based on popularity, not based on wealth, but based on spiritual impact. There were believers whose names carried weight because of their consistent worship. When they began to worship, movements were triggered because their pattern had already been established. The spiritual fire was already known. So when they entered worship, darkness did not wait to see what would happen. They reacted immediately. Emergency rituals were activated without hesitation because history had proven this person is not casual, this person is not weak, this person does not stop easily. You need to understand something very clearly. Consistency builds authority you cannot see until it is tested, and when it is tested, it reveals power you did not know you carried. That is why the enemy fights your consistency more than your intensity. He does not mind if you worship strongly once, but he fears when you make it a habit. That is when your environment begins to shift, your home atmosphere changes, your thoughts begin to align, your spirit becomes sensitive, and suddenly things that used to affect you lose their power. That is not coincidence. That is the result of sustained spiritual pressure. The agent shared a moment that exposed this truth clearly. There was a believer who had been consistent for months, quiet, unknown, unseen by people, but very visible in the spirit. One day, that believer entered worship again. Nothing looked different physically, but in the unseen, everything shifted. Emergency signals were triggered instantly because that level of consistency had reached a breaking point. And when it breaks, systems collapse. You need to hear this carefully. Your consistency is building something, even when you don't feel it, even when you don't see results immediately. Every moment of true worship is adding pressure. Every act of surrender is strengthening your authority. And eventually, that pressure reaches a level where darkness cannot contain it anymore. That is when they panic. That is when emergency rituals are called. Not because of what you did once, but because of what you refuse to stop doing. So ask yourself this question: are you consistent or occasional? Because occasional worship shakes nothing, but consistent worship breaks systems, destroys patterns, silences voices of darkness, and shifts entire atmospheres. You are not just building a habit, you are building spiritual force. And once that force matures, there is no ritual strong enough to stop it. There is something even deeper, something more dangerous than powerful worship and consistent worship. The ex-Satanic agent revealed this with fear in his voice. He said there is a kind of worship that is born in pain. And when believers worship from that place, emergency rituals are not just activated, they are desperate. Because pain-driven worship carries a force that darkness cannot predict. You see, most people worship when things are good, when life is stable, when emotions are calm. But there is another level where you worship when everything is falling apart, when prayers seem unanswered, when doors are closed, when tears are your daily language. And instead of giving up, you still lift your voice. That kind of worship terrifies darkness. The agent explained why. Because pain-driven worship cannot be manipulated. It cannot be easily distracted. It cannot be easily silenced. It is raw. It is real. It is unbreakable. He described how in their system they could predict many believers. They knew who would stop when pressure came. They knew who would become discouraged. They knew who would withdraw. But there was a category they could not control: those who worship through pain. Because when suffering comes, most people weaken. But these believers, they go deeper. and that breaks every expectation of darkness. The agent said this clearly: when a believer worships in pain, we lose control of the outcome. Do you understand the weight of that statement? It means your pain can become your greatest weapon, not your weakness, not your limitation, your weapon. Because when you worship in pain, you are not depending on feelings, you are not relying on circumstances, you are operating from conviction, and conviction is dangerous. He described the moment that shook their entire system. A believer had lost something significant, emotionally broken, physically drained, mentally overwhelmed. Everything pointed to silence, everything suggested retreat. But instead, that believer began to worship. Not loudly, not for attention, but deeply. And in that moment, emergency rituals were triggered at the highest level. Because pain-driven worship releases a different kind of authority. It carries sacrifice, and sacrifice speaks louder in the spirit than comfort ever can. You need to hear this clearly. When you worship in comfort, it is good. But when you worship in pain, it becomes a weapon of war. The agent revealed that darkness struggles to withstand that level because it contradicts their strategy. Their goal is to use pain to silence you, to make you withdraw, to make you question, to make you stop engaging with God. But when you do the opposite, you disrupt their entire plan. And that disruption forces emergency action. Because now, your pain is producing power, and that power is unpredictable. Have you ever felt like giving up, but something inside you refused to stay silent? That is the moment you are most dangerous. Not when everything is perfect, but when everything is broken, and you still choose worship. That choice carries weight in the spirit. Agents said there were moments when they observed believers like this, and they could not stop what was being released. Because pain-driven worship opens a dimension where divine intervention becomes immediate. Chains break faster. Oppression weakens instantly. Atmospheres shift without delay. Why? Because sacrifice has been activated. And sacrifice draws a response that cannot be ignored. So instead of allowing pain to silence you, use it. Turn it into fuel. Let every tear become a declaration. Let every struggle become a reason to press deeper. Because when you worship through pain, you step into a level of authority that forces darkness into panic mode. Emergency rituals are not called for comfort worshippers. They are called for those who refuse to break, those who refuse to stop, those who turn pain into power. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, do not withdraw, do not stay silent, do not surrender to discouragement. Lift your voice, even if it shakes, even if it feels weak, because in that moment, you are releasing something that darkness cannot control. And once it is released, there is no system strong enough to contain it. There is a final dimension, the most dangerous of them all. The ex-Satanic agent did not speak about it casually. His tone changed, his words slowed, because this level of worship cannot be countered easily. He said there are believers who move beyond moments, beyond consistency, beyond pain, and enter a state of spiritual authority in worship, not occasional, not situational, but established. This is where emergency rituals begin to fail. You need to understand what that means. Up to this point, darkness can respond. They can attempt to interrupt. They can try to resist. But at this level, the response becomes ineffective. Because the believer is no longer reacting, they are governing. The agent described these believers as rare, not because they are chosen differently, but because they have surrendered completely. Their worship is not an event. It is their identity. They don't wait for music. They don't wait for the right atmosphere. They carry it. Wherever they go, the presence of God is established. And that changes everything. Because now, darkness is not dealing with moments of power. They are dealing with a person who has become a vessel of authority. The agent revealed something that should shake you deeply. There are believers we avoid, not resist, not fight, avoid. Because the level of worship has already defeated the need for battle. Do you hear that? Before anything begins, victory is already established. That is the level where emergency rituals lose their effect, because there is nothing left to counter. The believer is already operating from dominion. He described how these individuals enter environments, and without saying a word, atmospheres begin to shift, oppression lifts, confusion clears, darkness weakens. Why? Because their worship has become continuous, not just in action, but in state of being. They are aligned, they are surrendered, they are focused, and that alignment creates authority that cannot be challenged. You need to understand something critical. This level is not achieved by accident, it is built through consistent surrender, through pressing enduring pain, through refusing distraction. Over time, your worship transforms you. It changes how you think, it changes how you respond, it changes how you engage with the spiritual realm. Until one day, you are no longer fighting for breakthrough, you are walking in it. The agent explained that when such believers are identified, there is no panic, there is no emergency ritual, there is withdrawal, because the system recognizes this one cannot be stopped. And this is where you are being called, not to moments of power, not to temporary intensity, but to a lifestyle that produces authority, where your worship is not something you do, it is who you are, where your presence carries weight, where your voice carries power, where your life carries evidence of dominion. So the question is no longer, can darkness respond to your worship? The question becomes, have you reached the level where they cannot respond at all? Because that is the ultimate goal. Not constant battle, but established authority, where victory is not something you chase, it is something you carry. And once you reach that level, everything changes. Your environment shifts, your influence increases, your spiritual impact becomes undeniable, and darkness has no choice but to step back. This is your awakening moment. You are not powerless, you are being trained. Your worship is not small, it is a weapon being sharpened. Rise beyond routine, rise beyond inconsistency, rise beyond fear and pain. Step into authority and let your worship speak where words cannot. Because when you reach that level, nothing in darkness will be able to stand before you.